What is up, Slackers, and welcome to another episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. Whether you're joining me on the audio or video version of the podcast, thank you for coming back for another episode. So, a couple of weeks ago, I received an email that had reminded me that I'd put a deposit down on a particular piece of hardware. I don't know how I forgot about it, but I've been waiting for quite some time to get the authorization that my time in the queue was ready. So it actually came pretty quickly, but what I bought here is the Steam Deck. So I would consider myself a occasional gamer. In fact, I'm entitling this episode "Worst Gamer Ever" because, frankly, I think our generation came a little bit too late to become like professional gamers. That wasn't a thing when we were young. I don't think I would have been very competitive anyway, because when I have tried to do any of these games where you go online and play against other players, I'm terrible at it. But I do enjoy gaming, and I think that we were the first generation that had video games from the very beginning, and certainly we're the first generation to have home consoles. So whether it was the original Pong, the Atari 2600, whether it was the early days of the Nintendo gaming system and all the different variations that have come since then. Some people had like the NES games, ColecoVision, and Sega Genesis, or the Dreamcast. And of course, this goes all the way up to the first generation of PlayStation and the Microsoft Xbox. So I was just kind of going through memory lane, as I'm apt to do for the podcast, and I decided to talk about some of my favorite games. This kind of runs I don't think contrary necessarily, but there's certainly different camps in the gaming world. So you have your PC gamers and you have your console gamers. Now, some people are both, and I would consider myself both. But then the people who are really focused on one or the other, like they're PC only, and they have these amazing gaming PCs. Or you have the people who are brand specific, so PlayStation versus Xbox. And for me, I kind of like the option of all these different possible games that you can get, and that's why I like Steam. And my understanding is the first like Steam hardware wasn't particularly all that well received, but so far I've really enjoyed having the Steam and just the pure diversity and the pure like massive library that you have available to play everything. So one of the games that I have on here, I'll be talking about in a couple of minutes because it was one of my all-time favorite series, and having the opportunity to play it again has been a little bit or a lot of fun. And just the first time I did a playthrough, it was really amazing how it brought me back. Even the soundtrack, it was like, holy cow. But we'll get to that in just a minute. So, what are my favorite games of all time? This is my top 10. So this doesn't just stick us in the 80s or even the 90s. This goes all the way up to the early 2000s because I think that's appropriate, particularly as we are seeing games actually really blossom and develop, particularly in the early 2000s. Certain game developers that were really pushing the limits of what you could actually do with gaming software. So, let's kick it off. So, one of the first games that I ever finished. I wasn't always a completionist when I was younger. I am now. Now, like if I play a game, I have to finish it. The original Legend of Zelda, 1986. This was with the gold cartridge, which in and of itself looked amazing. It just looked cool. It looked like none of the other games. Everything else was gray. And it was telling you this epic story. So if you grew up, as I did, and many of us did, with the Dungeons and Dragons. I wasn't a player of Dungeons and Dragons, but I loved that fantasy and Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Really enjoyed those types of series, franchises, whatever you want to call them. So Legend of Zelda just really fit into this very beautiful spot for me as far as what my interests were. Now, for lay people, it's always strange to go, wait a minute. So the Legend of Zelda, really the main character is actually Link, right? This is true. Link is your protagonist. He's the hero of the story. And Zelda, oddly enough, is the damsel in distress, although we come to find out later on, is very capable in her own right. And of course, your big bad is Ganon. Looking back on just the very simple graphics, right? That 8-bit graphic and the side scrollers, it was still really challenging. Tedious. It was very tedious because many of the levels looked the same, but like different enemies. Now, it's been a million years since I've played it, but I know, and I just remember it being really challenging. And like my stepdad at the time, he was also interested in gaming, much more casually, of course. And it's like, this is a very difficult game. But there was just something about it. And here you have a franchise that, 40 years later is still going strong. And many will say that the most recent release, I guess it wasn't the most recent, there was one in between, but the Breath of the Wild is considered one of the greatest games of all time. Now, I haven't played it, but my oldest son has played it, total completionist. And that is a massive, massive world. He spent hours on that thing, honestly. Like, he should have been out touching grass, but it was so immersive and so vast and so beautiful, like beautiful animation. So, Legend of Zelda will always have a soft spot in my heart. Speaking of the NES, there was another game that came out in 1987, and that is Mega Man. Of course, as it's originally known in Japan, Rockman. Now, Mega Man was so interesting in the fact that when you defeated one of the bosses of that particular game, you then acquired their abilities. So if you had something that was, so think of like elementals, right? So water would defeat fire, for example. So you would acquire these abilities and then be able to use them to actually move forward in the game. It was just very clever storytelling, really simplistic gameplay, although, like many of those side scrollers, rather difficult. I never played any of the sequels, although I did read some of the comics for a little bit. It was a really great series, but that original game, just hours of my life playing that. So I was just talking about my son spending hours on Breath of the Wild. I spent hours on Mega Man. Like I said, worst gamer ever. It would take me forever to get through these games. So I was never a huge fan of the side scrollers. This is really one of the few games that I had to complete. I was never in, and I know this is like sacrilege for some people, I was never into Mario Brothers as much. I didn't find it enjoyable. But Mega Man, because it had these interesting themes, I was much more apt to really find myself truly enjoying it. So shout out to Mega Man. Now, things began to change for me a little bit as far as starting to play PC games. So there's a game developer called Sierra Entertainment, and they had a number of well-known franchises. Perhaps they're best known for King's Quest. There was Police Quest, seeing a theme here, and of course the raunchy adult title Leisure Suit Larry. But for me, of all the series that Sierra had put out, the one that really captured me was a game that was originally called Hero's Quest. But because of competing copyright, they had to change the name to the Quest for Glory series. But the very first game, Hero's Quest, Quest for Glory, it was So You Want to Be a Hero. And it was the first game that was, in my experience, you were able to pick 3 different types of characters. So you had your fighter, your magician, and your thief. And you could play as all 3 characters, and it's a completely different gaming experience. That was really groundbreaking to me at the time. I was fascinated by the fact that, so wait a minute, but I could mix up their attributes. So the fighter maybe has some stealth, maybe pick a lock here or there. I could make the magician maybe a little bit of a strong fighter. It was really something like I'd never experienced before. So again, kind of being into that Dungeons and Dragons, kind of fantastical kind of stuff, I really found myself spending entirely too much time playing it, and I've begun playing it again. But it was also something that I'd never experienced before, was when I completed the game. So, whether it was as a fighter, magician, or a thief, when you got to the end of the game, you could then save your character. And all of the attributes that they had completed the game with. Now, I didn't know why I should go ahead and back this up. Now, I think the whole game is like in the kilobytes, like tiny, when you compare it to like these massive games that are like 128 gig or whatever. So I save it on floppy disks and I back it all up. And wouldn't you know it, you get a sequel. And the sequel came out in 1990 and it was called Trial by Fire. And there were characters that you had interacted with in the first game that now you've gone to their world, which is very reminiscent of like the Arab countries, very much based on Arabian Nights. Excuse me. So your character could then start off the game with stronger attribute levels. So brilliant. Now you could start it from scratch, but I'd never experienced that before. That was new to me from a gameplay perspective. You weren't going to get that on the console games. Like you didn't finish Mario Brothers and then have like a character level. You know, it just didn't exist with those kind of games. So this was truly groundbreaking for me. Now, I don't think I played the last two games in the series, but I'm gonna put them on my list just as a franchise because it was, to me, my first foray into PC gaming and just truly an enjoyable experience. And one that even now, after all these years, I can go back and play it. And that was the game where I said, as soon as the main menu came up and I saw the graphics, it was like I was home. There really was this strong sense of nostalgia. They talk about smells and sounds and sights and how they really bring you back to a particular time. It was like putting on an old comfy robe. And I'd never experienced that before. So Sierra as a company, really great stuff. And I'm hoping to see that there's more stuff out here. I did play a version of King's Quest on the Xbox a few years ago, but the gameplay really wasn't what I was expecting. It was good, but not great. So then there was a new player in the marketplace. It was a new gaming platform, and they were really launching with a very different type of game. And this is 1992, and the Sega Genesis, and the game that I'm talking about is the first Mortal Kombat. This game had everything a teenage boy could want. It was a fighting game. It had these things called fatalities, and the graphics were photo capture. Now, we've come to expect that at this point. You know, in 2021, 2022, some of the games that have come out recently have literally had all-star casts. If not A-list, then certainly B and C-list, well-known actors are taking part in creating video games. Full motion capture, beautiful animation, but Mortal Kombat was the first one, or at least the first one that I remember, that came out with that style. I mean, hours. Again, hours and hours. And what was great about this is that you could fight against your friends. Now, there were other games that you could play against your friends before that. I think you can do either co-op or against each other in games like Double Dragon, some of that NES stuff. But Mortal Kombat was like no other. And just how violent it was, I do think that there were a lot of parents at the time, and I've mentioned that I didn't have a lot of restrictions on content, but even my mom was kind of like, I don't know, this game is a little gory, isn't it? Didn't he like pull out like some guy's spine? Seems a bit much, but it was a lot of fun, and I really loved having that gaming console. But that wasn't the only game that came out in that console that was a fighting game that really was a bonding experience, let's put it that way, with a bunch of my friends. So in 1993, we got Street Fighter II but the Special Champions Edition. Now, there was already a version of Street Fighter, both 1 and 2, on the NES. Those first couple of versions, they're still great. I ended up getting one of those reissues of the second version of Nintendo. So you just plugged into the TV, and it had Street Fighter on there. It was a lot of fun. But that Street Fighter on Sega Genesis, we had tournaments upon tournaments that would like start in like the mid-afternoon and run straight to the night. It was such an infinitely playable game. And we didn't use that term then. At least I don't remember using the term then. But spamming. And I think what we said, sweep, cheat, and win. Sweep the leg over and over and over again. Unless your opponent was really, really good, they weren't going to be able to get in there, and it was a cheap win. Or if you figured out the power moves, what do they call it now? Z trigger, V trigger, something like that. V trigger, right? You could just go ahead and decimate someone. And we had to make rules for the tournaments. Otherwise, people would just hit the same move over and over again. And there was no possible way to win. But that Street Fighter 2, that Special Champions Edition, that is an all-time classic. And again, all of these franchises that I've mentioned, with the exception of like the Sierra games, like that PC game for that Heroes Quest, everything else is still running. Legend of Zelda, still going strong. Mega Man, every couple years I think they put out a new one. No, actually, I think it's been a while now. But I think Mega Man is a character in Smash Brothers. Mortal Kombat, still making games, and still finding new ways to make variations of the game. And certainly the Injustice series, so the DC Comics Injustice, that was a really interesting twist on it. Having the DC characters, and then they ended up having the Injustice versus Mortal Kombat kind of mashup. Very, very cool stuff. Street Fighter, I think they have a new one in development that's going to be coming out anytime now. But those fighting games, those were groundbreakers and really pushing the limits of what you were doing at gaming at that time, particularly those two. So back on PC, I have no idea how I came across this game, but I've mentioned in the past that my mom was an early adopter of technology, and part of it was she was learning about computers very early on. So we had a VIC-20, a Commodore 64, because she wanted to learn basic programming language, because she felt as though that's how things were moving. So we'd always had a computer. So I think it was she who brought this game to me, because you got to kill Nazis. And everybody wants to kill Nazis in video games and movies, etc. Wolfenstein 3D. So that was one of the first-person shooters that I'd ever played before. Oh gosh, that was again a game I had to finish, and I should go back and play it because I don't exactly remember the ending, although I think it set up a sequel. But I played that far more than I played Doom. I think most people think of Doom because I think that's a franchise that's also been recurrent, but Wolfenstein, that was my first-person shooter. And I didn't necessarily love that style of game at the time, although later on I would become a very big fan of that first-person shooter. But it was blocky, it's labyrinths, but it also had some jump scares. Certainly Doom had more of the jump scares because the themes themselves were, demonic and evil. But hey, weren't the Nazis demonic and evil? Really cool game, and one that I think of fondly, and has to be in my top 10 list from all the games that I played during the time period that I'm talking about. So I've kind of focused for the most part on the games that were home console. And the next game that I'm going to mention was on the home console. However, I think myself, like many, fell in love with this game quarter after quarter after quarter at the arcade. And that is NBA Jam. Now, I will admit, I have been on and off with sports my whole life. There have been some times that I've been completely immersed in it. Other times where basically a passing fancy, reading the newspaper and, keeping up on it that way. Or as I mentioned in a couple episodes, listening to sports radio. But when this game came out, I wasn't watching the NBA much at all. So this was actually a great opportunity to learn about certain players. Now, very limited roster. And there were many teams that you didn't have like the main player. Michael Jordan was not an NBA Jam. You had Scottie Pippen in an NBA Jam. And I think in that 93, was it Pippen and Rodman? I think so. Those were your first two, your big ones. I don't remember the entire roster, but it was always so interesting that you didn't have always the big franchise player. I don't think David Robinson was in there every year. I think he was for a couple. But anyway, the NBA Jam, I think, is so well known for its catchphrases. Boom shakalaka. He's on fire from downtown. So I will tell you that right on the other side of the wall here is a arcade console of NBA Jam. You know, my son is so into basketball. In fact, he's out there playing NBA 2K right now. But for one of his birthdays, we got the NBA Jam console, and he loved it. And his friends came over, and the opportunity to see 4 teenage boys standing at the console playing the arcade game the way that we used to was just really, really cool. And it's such a fun game to play. So, huge shout out to NBA Jam. And I'm hoping they come out with some new versions of it, because I think it would be really cool to have like that style of gameplay again, kind of cartoonish, because now everything is focused on the hyper realism and like having the true scans of all the players. But sometimes you just want to go out there and shoot from half court and, you know, have your guy on fire. So now we're moving into the 2000s. Now there is one game on here that I'm going to mention that was, I played it for PC and on console. But I think the game that was the true game changer, I don't think it can be denied for all the ways that I mentioned Mortal Kombat being a game changer. But even going back to, I mean, Mario Brothers was game changing at the time. 2001, and I had to buy it. My very first original Xbox. And I'm talking about Halo Combat Evolved. I can just tell you that from the very moment I turned on that game, you have cutscenes, you have storytelling, and you have legitimately tense, thematic, cinematic moments. So there's a part of the game where you get introduced to the enemies called the Flood. And you enter into a room and there's just like ominous music and it's very dark, it's black, and then it goes quiet and you just hear something in the background. And then they just rush you on the screen. It was one of the most stressful, again, immersive, really powerful moments that I'd ever had in gaming. There'd been nothing like that before. That entire experience from start to finish was truly breathtaking. And I remember taking that console. Well, actually, I just took the games with me. So my brother-in-law had just gotten an Xbox, but he had very few games. And he is, at the time, I want to say like 14 or 15, something like that. So anyway, I have one of my, guest of the show, Daniel, who was on the show for NXS, and my brother-in-law, David. We ended up playing this, and we would swap off at certain points because you could do 2-player co-op. And we just played the whole game through, like start to finish. We started at like, I don't know, 7, 8 o'clock at night and went straight to the wee hours of the morning. But what's so great about the game is that you didn't just have different bosses and levels, you had different types of gameplay. Now, I think there are other games that were like that. I want to say like Metal Gear was like that, where you could go from just being, shooting, for example, to taking over a vehicle. Contra, I think, was like that as well back in the day. But this was such amazing, from a graphical perspective, it was just amazing and immersive. So this was like nothing else. And that whole end sequence, when you're in, what is it called, the Warthog, and you got one person driving and one person holding down the gun in the back, and you're going across this bridge, and it's a nail biter, and there's such tension. Such a good, powerful game. So the reason that Xbox, I think, really became like the platform, and I know some of the PlayStation folks are going to be like, no way, it's not as good. I don't know. I've never owned a PlayStation. My stepdad did. I enjoyed some of the games, but Xbox had really set the standard at that point with that exclusive to Xbox franchise in Halo. And that's why it still goes on today. And it's in other media as well. Between the animated series, I think they're talking about a theater release. Really cool story. Now, sidebar. There is a game that's not on my list. But believe me, I thought about it, but I never finished it. So I only put on games that I finished. And that was a game called StarCraft, which I played on PC. I'm pretty sure before Halo came out. I'd have to double check that. But you had the different races. You had your aliens, and you had your, what are they, Protoss and the Zerg. Very, very similar in a lot of ways to some of the storytelling that was happening in Halo. So I look at those as being kind of cousins, if you will. So kindred spirits, but two completely different styles of gameplay. But Halo Combat Evolved, legendary classic, one of the top selling games of all time. And I have to tell you, it was worth every minute of it. So the next game on the list came out in the year 2000. And I played this on both PC and I played it on Xbox. And that is Hitman, codename 47. So I will tell you that I enjoyed the PC experience. I did. A lot of fun. Very cool game. However, playing Hitman on console was much more enjoyable, at least for me. So I always looked at Halo as just being a balls to the walls, all out, shoot everything that you can. And some levels, certainly, like you had to, like that was the mission. You had to shoot everything that you possibly could. Otherwise, you're dead meat. Hitman, on the other hand, had stealth. So remember, I mentioned back when I was talking about those Quest for Glory games and that you could play as the thief. So I was already well versed and understood the dynamics of a game that required stealth. In the Quest for Glory games, it was called sneaking. But here you had stealth. And how sound and like the AI, even for back then, was developed enough that you could be sensed if you made one wrong move. It was, I guess you could say, like the theme is not necessarily the most, I don't want to say justifiable or moral or ethical, but when you get more into the mythos of the character, you find some redeeming qualities and who it is that are his targets and victims. But it also depends on how you play the game, because you can play the game where you're completely taking into account whether you're taking a life or not. And I feel like that dynamic was really, really interesting and not one that was in a lot of games, because it really, I think it says a lot about you, how you play a game like Hitman. And that's going to bring me to another game that I hadn't put on the list, but I'll talk about in just a minute, as far as your choices mattering. But Hitman was very, very adult from every possible perspective, including just some of the themes, some of the characters that you interact with. There's a very heavy, religious piece of it. It was very deep, immersive storytelling, and again, a beautiful game. I do know that a version has just come out. Now, when I was playing just Steam on my Mac, Macs aren't great for gameplay. So I'm curious to see how the brand new Hitman game functions on Steam because it looks amazing. I'm just not sure if I have the patience that I used to have to be able to get through that game. But I just mentioned, the actual, making decisions for your character. So a game that I probably should have put on my list because I ended up borrowing it from a friend. It was like, you have to play this game. It's truly amazing. I forget what year. It's probably maybe 2001, 2002. But that was a game called Fable. And Fable was so interesting because literally every decision that you made impacted not only how the story went, but impacted the look and feel of your character. So if you played it totally good, like not a questionable, response to anything, you end up with like a halo and like white blonde hair, white clothes, you're glowing, you're magnificent, you're perfect and unstained. Or you make all the bad choices and your character's dark and evil and ominous, and who you interact with and how you interact with is all impacted by the choices that you make. So Fable, very cool game. I think they made a sequel and I never played. But any games that kind of put you into a position to make these kind of decisions, I think has really, it has replay value as well, because you can play the game so differently depending on how you choose to play the game. And I think that's really intriguing, and it could only be done on games really on these other consoles. Obviously, you can play it on PC too, but really cool gameplay. Hitman, got to be on the list. Codename 47, really good stuff. I'm a huge fan of Timothy Olyphant, but he wasn't great as Agent 47, but I don't think it was a particularly well-written movie either. So for anyone who's seen the Codename 47, I think they called it Hitman 47 or whatever, not a great movie. So that brings me to my favorite game of all time. Like all time. There was a sequel, 2 sequels, played the second, not as good. But it was a game that was very, very dark. And it got mixed reviews at the time for some of the more intriguing elements to me that made it look and feel like no other. It had this very graphic novel kind of neo-noir feel to it, but it had gameplay mechanics that was like none of the other games. None of the other shooters had this, and it was based upon something that had become kind of legendary in film. So anyone who's seen the movies, the Matrix movies, knows about bullet time. So in bullet time, everything slows down, or it appears to slow down. Now, really what's happening is they're moving at super fast speeds, but in this game, using bullet time meant that everything else around you slowed down, which allowed you the opportunity to more easily hone in and mow down your enemies, basically. And I'm talking about 2001's Max Payne. This is a truly, truly immaculate game, in my opinion. It had everything that you could want. And it just grew bigger as the game went on, as you dug down into a major conspiracy. So Max Payne is a cop, loses his wife and kid in the midst of all this. He's constantly getting shot. So how does he keep going? You don't get power-ups. No, he literally would find prescription pills. I said it was dark. He'd find pills, he'd pop them, he's healed, he keeps going on. There was this one sequence, and it was actually a recurring sequence that was kind of like I guess it was a dream sequence, where you just had the sound of a crying baby in the background as you're getting lost in this labyrinth and trying to find your way out. And it's one of those games where you have to figure out kind of like the pattern of like each corridor that you take to find your way out. And at one point you're like floating out in space Now, basically, the guy is tripping out of his mind because of all the drugs. Plus, there's this like illicit drug that's going out into the marketplace. Gosh, I should remember the name of it. It's like Angel something. But anyway, it culminates in having to enter. So again, I mentioned the Matrix, right? So Keanu Reeves' character, so Neo and Trinity, they end up going into a building, and they're you remember the scene where there's the foyer, and they have this major fight in the foyer. Basically, you have to they fight their way up. Same thing here. Max has to fight his way all the way up a skyscraper. He has to get to the roof. Like, that's the mission. And how you've just had this whole gameplay experience. Now, not open world. Oh gosh, that'd be amazing. But everything built, I look at it really as a movie where you had your like smaller set pieces and how that continued to grow and grow and grow. So here you have the big finale, and you're fighting your way from the ground floor to the top floor. And there's like little elevator scenes and like escalators and fighting all these bad guys to make your way up to figure out, to really finalize the conspiracy and put it to rest. Helicopters, just everything that you could possibly want in this kind of hard-boiled, first person. Well, actually, it's a third-person shooter, by the way. It's a third-person shooter because in order for the mechanics of bullet time to work, you kind of had to see the character. But really well acted, in my opinion, that the way that they moved in between the graphic novels, so instead of just doing your traditional cutscenes, it was literally kind of telling the story like the old pulp fiction. Like not the movie, but like the pulp magazines from like the 1920s and 30s. It really was such a cool gameplay experience. I did find the sequel to be lacking, and my understanding is the third one had a completely different style of play. However, it got exceptional reviews as far as its gameplay. The only real criticism was, is it still a Max Payne game if you're playing it in this style? And that maybe had lost a little bit of what made that franchise kind of unique and like no other. So, that is my little walk down my favorite video games. Now, I'm sure there are a number of them that I am forgetting that I played throughout the years. I wanted to keep it into things that you could firmly call Gen X. And the reason I went into like the early 2000s is certainly some of the younger Gen Xers too would have been like still in high school, or no, they've just graduated high school. So they're in college. So I'm in my mid 20s, they're in their early 20s when these games came out. And I just think that it's completely appropriate and generationally accurate to carry on with this timetable. There are games that I've played since then. Guiltiest of pleasures is a game called Plants vs. Zombies for the Xbox. I just got the second one. I ended up playing it on Switch. The first one I completed. The second one I haven't. It's massive. It's huge. And it's actually incredibly difficult. And you would think that's, not the kind of game that would lend itself to high levels of difficulty. But the multiplayer online stuff, amazing. Absolutely amazing. And if I wasn't sticking to this whole timetable deal, I would say that after Max Payne, my second favorite game of all time is Destiny 2. Not Destiny 1, Destiny 2. Part of it is that it has amazing voice acting, most specifically Nathan Fillion, who's one of my favorite actors. But that Destiny 2 game, you want to talk about difficult people to play against online. I don't think I ever won a round. Ever. I think I maybe would be in like top 1 or 2 spots, occasionally like 2 or 3, but never the top spot. I would in Plants vs. Zombies. I'm probably against, little children who were playing that, although doubtful. I'm sure there were, guys like me who were on there playing. But Destiny was really, really difficult to play on a competitive basis. That's why I kind of call myself the worst gamer ever. I love doing it, but I get constantly smoked. Particularly just how good some people are at these games. Now, maybe it's because I have a career, I have 3 kids, a wife, a dog, a podcast. I don't get a ton of time to game. So I know that you really have to grind and grind and grind. However, I am considering for additional content on the YouTube channel to maybe start doing some gaming, particularly retro gaming. And some of the games that are on the list, if I can get them on Steam, I'm definitely going to play. I am going to start with that Heroes Quest series, though, just because I love it, and it's such a little slice of that early 90s PC gaming. And I just love it, the genre itself. Tell me in the comments, what are your favorite video games? Let's say from 1980 to 2001. What are your favorite games? What are your favorite consoles? Do you prefer PC? PlayStation? Xbox? Are you a Dreamcast person? Let me know. I'd love to hear from you. And would you be interested in seeing some streaming gameplay? Because I'm probably going to do that pretty soon once I figure out some of the logistics. Because the thing with the Steam Deck is it's actually a Linux-based PC, so you can go between the Steam platform and it functions as a desktop. It truly is a handheld computer. So I think I have a lot of options and a lot of potential to play a ton of games. So let me know what you'd like to see. You can reach me on Twitter and Instagram at StuckPodX. You can find me on the YouTube channel, StuckPodX. You can head over to my Facebook page, Stuck in the Middle, a Gen X podcast. You can email me at stuckinthemiddlepod@yahoo.com. Please leave 5-star reviews, like, comment, and most importantly, subscribe to the podcast. So, until next time, later, slackers.